The summer of 1914, Europe, having balanced on the brink of a major war for centuries, finally plunged into the abyss. The shots in Sarajevo were merely the trigger for a mechanism that had been assembled for decades from the ambitions, fears, and mutual suspicions of the great powers. In the West, German troops had already invaded Belgium, seeking to bypass French defenses according to the Schlieffen Plan. But in the East, an equally dramatic picture was unfolding. Here, on the borders of the Russian Empire and Germany, in lands we now know as Poland, two colossal war machines clashed. East Prussia, a German salient wedged between Russian territories, became the arena of the first serious engagement. For Russia, these lands were the key to the heart of Germany. For the Germans, they were sacred territory that could not be surrendered to the enemy under any circumstances. And the Poles, divided between empires, could only watch as their land once again became a battlefield for foreign armies. By early August 1914, the Russian and German commands had diametrically opposed strategic objectives. Russia, bound by Allied obligations to France, had to launch an offensive as soon as possible to divert German forces from the Western Front. Germany, on the other hand, aimed to first defeat France while holding its eastern borders with minimal forces. The Russian plan for the invasion of East Prussia looked quite logical on paper. Two armies, the first under General Rennenkampf from the east and the second under General Samsonov from the south, were to, moving in pincers, encircle and destroy the German troops. But this plan contained a fatal flaw: the lack of reliable communication between the armies, which were separated by the Masurian lakes and vast forest areas. The German command, having left only 1/8 army under General Prittwitz to defend East Prussia, counted on the advantages of internal communications and railways, which allowed for quick redeployments of troops between threatened sectors. The state of the opposing armies reflected the fundamental differences between the two empires. The Russian army, despite reforms after the Russo-Japanese War, remained a colossus with feet of clay. Millions of mobilized peasants under the command of often inexperienced officers, armed with outdated rifles, with an insufficient number of artillery and machine guns, with interruptions in ammunition supply, such was the reality of the Russian war machine. The German army was a model of efficiency and technological superiority. Excellently trained soldiers, a professional officer corps, advanced weaponry, and, critically, a perfect communication system that included field telephones and radio stations. The mobilization capabilities of the sides also differed strikingly. While Germany could transfer divisions from one section of the front to another within days via an extensive railway network, in Russia, mobilization stretched for weeks, and troop transfers became a logistical nightmare. The training of the officer corps played a special role. German officers, raised in the traditions of the Prussian military school, showed initiative and independence in decision-making. The Russian command, however, suffered from excessive centralization and a fear of responsibility. Generals Rennenkampf and Samsonov, moreover, were in strained personal relations after the Russo-Japanese War, which further complicated cooperation. The first maneuvers of the Russian armies seemed to develop successfully. On August 7, the First Army crossed the border of East Prussia, and a few days later, Samsonov's army moved from the south. The Germans began to retreat, creating the illusion of their weakness. The Russian command, elated by the initial successes, lost vigilance, unaware that the enemy was luring them into a deadly trap. In early August of 1914, two Russian armies moved to conquer East Prussia with a triumphant spirit. The First Army of General Pavel Karlovich Rennenkampf, numbering around 130,000 soldiers, advanced from the east. The Second Army, under the command of General Alexander Vasilyevich Samsonov, numbering around 140,000 men, moved from the south. According to the plan of the Russian General Staff, these forces were to trap the German Eighth Army in pincers and destroy it. On August 14th, Rennenkampf's troops won a battle near Gumbinnen, forcing the Germans to retreat. This success sparked euphoria at the Russian headquarters. The empire's newspapers were emblazoned with headlines about an imminent victory. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, the supreme commander-in-chief, already envisioned Russian banners over Königsberg. However, beneath the outward brilliance of the initial successes lay fatal problems. Rennenkampf's and Samsonov's armies were separated by a distance of 80 kilometers, filled with the Masurian lakes and impassable forests. Coordination between them was practically non-existent. The commanders used unencrypted radio messages, broadcast in plain text. Worse still, a personal animosity persisted between the generals since the Russo-Japanese War, when Rennenkampf accused Samsonov of indecisiveness. After the victory at Gumbinnen, Rennenkampf unexpectedly halted the pursuit of the retreating Germans. Instead of a swift forward thrust, his army spent precious days resting and regrouping. This inexplicable pause gave the German command critically important time to regroup. Meanwhile, Samsonov's army, exhausted by forced marches over sandy roads in the summer heat, slowly advanced northward. Soldiers marched 30 to 40 kilometers a day with full gear. Many collapsed from exhaustion. Supply trains lagged behind, disrupting the provision of food and ammunition. Reconnaissance was practically absent. The command had no accurate information about the disposition of German troops. The communication catastrophe worsened daily. The headquarters of the Northwestern Front, located in Siedlce, 300 kilometers from the front line, sent contradictory orders. General Yakov Zhilinsky, the front commander, demanded an immediate offensive from Samsonov, ignoring reports on the condition of the troops. When Samsonov attempted to adjust the direction of the attack, Zhilinsky sharply rebuked him, insisting on strict adherence to the original plan. As a result, Samsonov's army stretched across a front approximately 80 kilometers wide, losing its concentration of forces. Corps moved without maintaining contact with each other. The flanks remained open and vulnerable. Cavalry, which was supposed to conduct reconnaissance, was used inefficiently. On August 20th, the advanced units of the Second Army entered East Prussia. Contrary to expectations, they met no serious resistance. The German troops seemed to have vanished. This apparent ease of advance only strengthened the Russian command's overconfidence. No one suspected that Samsonov's army was, step by step, entering a gigantic trap carefully prepared by the new German command. In mid-August 1914, as the Russian offensive into East Prussia began to unfold, decisive changes occurred in the German command. After initial setbacks in clashes with Rennenkampf's army, the commander of the Eighth Army, General Max von Prittwitz, panicked and spoke of retreating behind the Vistula, effectively surrendering all of East Prussia. This provoked an immediate reaction in Berlin. The Supreme Command removed Prittwitz and appointed two officers in his place, whose names would soon become legendary. 67-year-old General Paul von Hindenburg was recalled from retirement, where he had been for several years. This veteran of the Franco-Prussian War, with his imposing figure and characteristic mustache, embodied Prussian military traditions. 48-year-old General Erich Ludendorff, who had distinguished himself during the capture of the Belgian fortress of Liège in the first days of the war, was appointed as his chief of staff. On August 23rd, they arrived at the headquarters of the Eighth Army in Marienburg. Legend has it that Hindenburg slept calmly on the way, and upon waking, asked Ludendorff. The latter replied that the plan was already ready, and Hindenburg approved it without objection. Thus began one of the most remarkable tandems in military history. Ludendorff, a brilliant tactician with an analytical mind, and Hindenburg, an experienced strategist with unshakable calm, complemented each other perfectly. Their first decision was a radical change in strategy. Instead of scattering forces to defend against both Russian armies, they decided to concentrate their attack against Samsonov's army, leaving minimal forces against Rennenkampf. This plan was incredibly risky. The Germans deliberately exposed their front against the First Russian Army, relying on Rennenkampf's slowness and the geographical barrier of the Masurian Lakes. If Rennenkampf had resumed his offensive, disaster for the Germans would have been inevitable. But Ludendorff, after analyzing intercepted radio messages and intelligence reports, concluded that the Russian armies were acting disjointedly. German corps began a rapid regrouping. Using an extensive network of railways, the Germans transferred troops from the eastern flank to the southern. Soldiers moved around the clock, often passing through Königsberg, where they were greeted by townspeople who offered food and flowers. This operation became a classic example of using internal communications to create local superiority. Ludendorff and Hindenburg accurately identified the weaknesses in Samsonov's army formation, gaps between corps and exposed flanks. The plan called for flanking attacks on the Russians, followed by encirclement. The German generals displayed astonishing flexibility of thought, constantly adjusting their actions depending on the changing situation. A key element of success was the use of radio intelligence. The Russians transmitted orders and reports in clear text, without encryption. German radio stations intercepted these messages, providing the command with invaluable information about enemy plans. Ludendorff sometimes knew about the movements of Russian corps even before Samsonov himself received reports from his subordinates. In the history of military art, there are moments when technology changes the rules of the game. Such a turning point was the use of radio intelligence in the Battle of Tannenberg. For the first time in the history of wars, electromagnetic waves became a weapon no less powerful than artillery or infantry. The German army entered World War I with a superior communication system. Each corps had its own radio station operating on a specific frequency. Field telephones connected headquarters with frontline units. But the main advantage lay not in the equipment itself, but in the radio interception system established long before the war began. As early as 1904, a network of stationary radio stations was deployed in East Prussia, capable of not only transmitting but also receiving signals from the territory of the Russian Empire. By August 1914, this system had been perfected. The Königsberg fortress housed the Radio Intelligence Center, where specially trained officers fluent in Russian served. The Russian army, on the other hand, treated radio communication as a technical novelty without realizing its strategic importance. Radio stations were only available at Army and Corps headquarters. A critical miscalculation was the use of unencrypted messages. Russian generals, unaccustomed to the new technology, transmitted orders in plain text, as if talking on the phone. When Rennenkampf's and Samsonov's armies invaded East Prussia, the airwaves were filled with a flood of Russian radiograms. German radio operators recorded every message, immediately forwarding them for deciphering. Soon, the first reports revealing the enemy's plans lay on Ludendorff's desk. On August 22nd, a turning point occurred. The headquarters of the Northwestern Front sent Samsonov a radiogram with a detailed plan for his army's offensive for the next 3 days. The message indicated the routes of movement of each corps, the time of reaching the lines, and the directions of the main attacks. This document, intercepted by the Germans, became a death sentence for the Russian army. Ludendorff, upon receiving this information, exclaimed, "The plan to encircle Samsonov's army was adjusted based on the received data. German corps moved precisely to intercept Russian units, about which they knew everything, from numbers to arrival times." Radio interception allowed the Germans to create the illusion of numerical superiority. In fact, the Eighth Army was numerically inferior to Samsonov's troops, but thanks to precise knowledge of the enemy's location, the Germans concentrated forces precisely where the Russians were most vulnerable. Especially valuable for the German command was the information about the growing gap between Rennenkampf's and Samsonov's armies. Intercepted radiograms confirmed that Rennenkampf was not rushing to help his neighbor, but was busy regrouping his forces. This allowed Ludendorff to withdraw almost all troops from the eastern direction and throw them against Samsonov. A tragic aspect of this story is that the Russian command did not even suspect the existence of radio interception. Generals continued to transmit secret information over the air, not understanding that every word they spoke became known to the enemy. When Samsonov's army was already encircled, desperate calls for help were broadcast over the air, which were also intercepted by the Germans, allowing them to close the last loopholes for retreat. On August 17, 1914, near the small town of Gumbinnen, the first major clash between Russian and German forces occurred. The First Russian Army, under General Rennenkampf, attacked German positions. Despite initial success by German cavalry, by evening the Russians had pushed back the enemy. The commander of the 8th German Army, General Prittwitz, impressed by the power of the Russian offensive, made the fateful decision to retreat behind the Vistula, effectively abandoning all of East Prussia. This immediately triggered a reaction in Berlin. Prittwitz was removed from command, replaced by the Hindenburg-Ludendorff tandem. The victory at Gumbinnen could have been the key to success for the entire campaign for the Russians, but Rennenkampf unexpectedly halted the pursuit of the retreating enemy. Instead of a swift thrust forward, his army spent 3 days in inaction. This inexplicable pause gave the German command precious time to regroup. The Germans masterfully exploited the situation. While Rennenkampf's army was inactive and Samsonov's army was slowly advancing from the south, Ludendorff devised a daring plan. He decided to transfer the main forces against Samsonov, leaving only a weak screen against Rennenkampf. Using the extensive railway network, German units executed rapid maneuvers, creating numerical superiority in decisive directions. On August 24, the battle began that would go down in history as the Battle of Tannenberg. The central core of Samsonov's army advanced, unaware of the danger. The Germans skillfully lured them deep into their defenses. At this time, the German corps of generals von Francois and von Mackensen began an outflanking movement. On August 26th, the trap snapped shut. The 15th and 13th Russian Corps found themselves completely encircled. Attempts to break through were unsuccessful. German artillery methodically destroyed the attacking columns. Communication between Russian units was completely disrupted. Corps commanders operated blindly, lacking information about their neighbors and the overall situation. Samsonov, realizing the scale of the catastrophe, attempted to personally lead the breakout from the encirclement. On August 28th, having lost contact with his headquarters and seeing the destruction of his army, he withdrew into the forest and shot himself. His body was found by a German patrol and buried with military honors. Meanwhile, Rennenkampf, having received belated information about the dire situation of the Second Army, began a slow movement to its aid. but it was already too late. Learning of Samsonov's complete defeat, he gave the order to retreat, fearing that his own army would also be encircled. By August 30, the battle concluded with the complete rout of Russian forces. Approximately 30,000 soldiers were killed, 92,000 were taken prisoner. The Germans captured 500 cannons and vast stores of military equipment. The Second Russian Army ceased to exist as a fighting unit. On August 26, 1914, the final phase of a drama began, one that would forever be inscribed in military textbooks as an example of the complete encirclement and annihilation of a large military formation. General Samsonov's army, numbering approximately 140,000 men, found itself in a deadly trap, planned with German methodicalness and precision. The ring of encirclement tightened with each passing hour. From the west, General von Francois's corps advanced, and from the east, General von Mackensen's forces. To the north, the Germans established a strong barrier, while the southern escape route was blocked by swamps and forests. Russian soldiers, exhausted by multi-day marches and continuous battles, found themselves in a cauldron from which there was practically no escape. The catastrophe was exacerbated by the complete collapse of the command and control system. The Army headquarters lost contact with most of its formations. Corps commanders acted blindly, unaware of the overall situation. Artillery had fired most of its shells, and supply trains with food and ammunition either lagged behind or were captured by the enemy. Soldiers went without food for 2 or 3 days, many collapsing from exhaustion right on the march. German artillery, superior in both the number of guns and the quality of shells, methodically shelled concentrations of Russian troops. Heavy howitzers proved particularly effective, against which field fortifications offered no protection. Russian artillery responded less and less frequently. The shortage of ammunition was taking its toll. General Samsonov, realizing the scale of the tragedy, attempted to personally lead the breakout. On August 27th, he set out with a small group of staff officers to the forward units. Communication with the front headquarters was lost, and Samsonov was left to his own devices in making decisions. On the night of August 28th, when it became clear that the army could not be saved, Samsonov separated from his companions and went into the forest. There, unwilling to be captured and unable to bear the shame of defeat, he shot himself with his personal revolver. His body was found by a German patrol only a few days later and buried with military honors. The scale of the catastrophe was staggering. Of the 140,000 soldiers in Samsonov's army, approximately 30,000 died in battle. 92,000 were taken prisoner. Only about 10,000 managed to break out of the encirclement in small groups, making their way through forests and swamps. The Germans captured 500 artillery pieces, thousands of machine guns, and supply trains with military equipment. The reasons for this defeat are numerous and complex. First and foremost, there was a lack of coordination between Rennenkampf's and Samsonov's armies. The First Army, having won a victory at Gumbinnen, halted its offensive and did not support its neighbor. Samsonov himself made a number of tactical errors, stretching the front of his offensive and exposing his flanks. The front headquarters, located far from the events, issued unrealistic orders that did not correspond to the situation. The German command, on the other hand, demonstrated the highest professionalism. Ludendorff and Hindenburg managed to maximize the use of internal communications for maneuvering troops. Radio intercepts provided them with invaluable information about enemy plans. German officers displayed initiative and independence in decision-making. When news of Samsonov's army's catastrophe reached General Rennenkampf's headquarters, the First Russian Army was in a state of strange stupor. After the successful battle at Gumbinnen, Rennenkampf, instead of energetically pursuing the retreating enemy, dedicated precious days to regrouping and resting his troops. This inexplicable hiatus in the offensive became one of the key reasons for the Second Army's defeat. Upon learning of Samsonov's critical situation on August 27th, when the encirclement was practically complete, Rennenkampf began a slow movement to the southwest. However, the pace of this movement was so unhurried that it created the impression that the general was deliberately avoiding confrontation with the enemy. Cavalry patrols, which could have quickly reached the encirclement area and at least diverted some German forces, were not sent ahead. By the time the forward units of the First Army approached the battle area, Samsonov's army had already ceased to exist. Upon receiving intelligence reports of the complete defeat of his neighbor and that German forces were turning to strike his own army, Rennenkampf decided to retreat from East Prussia. The retreat of the First Army turned into a hasty flight. The troops, who had only recently celebrated victory at Gumbinnen, were now chaotically abandoning enemy territory. German cavalry pursued the retreating forces, striking at their flanks and rear. Artillery and convoys got stuck on rain-soaked roads. Many units lost contact with army headquarters and retreated independently, choosing the shortest path to the border. Rennenkampf's actions caused bewilderment and outrage at Stavka. Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, demanded explanations. Why did an army, which had a numerical superiority over the enemy, so hastily abandon conquered positions? Why was no assistance provided to Samsonov's army when it was encircled? General Zhilinsky, commander of the Northwestern Front, tried to justify the retreat as a strategic necessity, but his arguments sounded unconvincing. He was soon removed from his post and replaced by General Ruzsky. Rennenkampf retained his position, but his reputation was irreparably damaged. Rumors circulated in military circles about Rennenkampf's deliberate inaction, attributed to personal animosity towards Samsonov. These accusations, though not officially confirmed, cast a shadow over the general for the rest of his career. A more balanced analysis points to systemic problems in the organization of interaction between armies and the overall inefficiency of front command. Polish lands, divided between the Russian and German empires, found themselves at the epicenter of one of the most dramatic battles of the initial stage of the First World War. For Poles, the Battle of Tannenberg became a particular ordeal. Their compatriots fought on both sides of the front, and their homes and fields were transformed into arenas of bloody battles. In August 1914, the Polish population of East Prussia found itself between a rock and a hard place. When Russian troops invaded the province, many ethnic Poles met them with mixed feelings. On the one hand, Tsarist Russia was perceived as a traditional oppressor of the Polish people. On the other hand, some hoped that the defeat of Germany might hasten the rebirth of an independent Poland. The Russian command tried to use the national question to its advantage. On August 1st, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich issued an appeal to Poles, promising the unification of Polish lands under the scepter of the Russian Emperor with the granting of autonomy. However, these promises sounded unconvincing to a people who had for decades experienced the policy of Russification in territories controlled by the Russian Empire. A significant number of ethnic Poles served in the German army that defeated the Russians at Tannenberg. There were especially many of them in the East Prussian regiments, recruited from the local population. These soldiers found themselves in a tragic situation. They had to defend their homes, fighting against an army that theoretically could bring liberation from German rule. The population of Polish villages and towns in East Prussia experienced all the horrors of war. Russian troops invading the province often treated local residents as a hostile element. Cases of requisitions and sometimes outright looting turned local Poles against the liberators. German authorities in turn suspected the Polish population of sympathizing with the enemy and established strict control. After the defeat of Samsonov's army and Rennenkampf's retreat, the situation of Poles in the occupied and liberated territories proved to be extremely difficult. German authorities began investigations into cases of treason. Any manifestation of loyalty to Russian troops could lead to severe punishment. At the same time, the German command realized the importance of the Polish question and began to revise its policy regarding the Polish population. The Battle of Tannenberg became a catalyst for the formation of a new Polish national idea. Many Polish intellectuals and politicians concluded that none of the warring empires would bring true freedom to their people. Józef Pilsudski, the future leader of independent Poland, wrote in those days, "A war between our oppressors is our chance, which we must use for our own liberation." The Battle of Tannenberg became a turning point in the course of the First World War on the Eastern Front. A military defeat of such magnitude could not but have far-reaching consequences for all participants in the conflict. For the Russian Empire, the rout of Samsonov's army and Rennenkampf's hasty retreat signified the collapse of hopes for a swift, victorious campaign. East Prussia, which many in Petrograd already considered conquered territory, remained in German hands. The immediate military consequence was a complete change in the strategic situation. The Russian command, which had recently been planning offensive operations, was forced to switch to defense. The Northwestern Front was weakened, losing about 120,000 soldiers and a huge amount of weaponry. It was impossible to make up these losses in a short time. Reserves were already being sent to the Southwestern Front, where a battle with the Austro-Hungarian army was unfolding in Galicia. The German command, emboldened by triumph, developed a plan for further offensive. The Eighth Army was reinforced and transformed into a new grouping under Hindenburg's command. In September 1914, the Germans launched an offensive on the Niemen, attempting to capitalize on their success. Although this offensive was halted, the initiative on the northern sector of the Eastern Front firmly passed to the German troops. The psychological consequences of Tannenberg proved no less significant than the military ones. For the Russian army, it was a crushing blow to morale. Soldiers who had recently been confident in their superiority now looked westward with apprehension, expecting new German strikes. The officer corps was demoralized. Many talented commanders died or were captured at Tannenberg. Rumors of betrayal and incompetence of the high command spread among the troops. In Germany, on the contrary, the victory sparked an explosion of patriotic enthusiasm. Hindenburg and Ludendorff became national heroes. Kaiser Wilhelm II personally arrived in East Prussia to award distinguished officers. Tannenberg became a symbol of German military genius, capable of achieving victories even against numerically superior adversaries. The political consequences of the battle were no less significant. In Russia, the defeat intensified criticism of the government and personally of Emperor Nicholas II. Opposition circles pointed to systemic problems in army organization and the inability of the authorities to effectively wage modern warfare. Ferment began in society, which 3 years later would lead to revolution. In Germany, the victory strengthened the position of the military in the state administration. Hindenburg and Ludendorff received virtually unlimited powers on the Eastern Front. Their influence on strategic decision-making steadily grew, ultimately leading to the formation of a peculiar military dictatorship in the final years of the war. The Battle of Tannenberg taught military theorists a lesson whose significance is difficult to overestimate. This battle pitted not just armies, but fundamentally different approaches to 20th century warfare against each other. The German war machine demonstrated the superiority of maneuver tactics over linear formations, the flexibility of command over rigid hierarchy, and technological advantage over numerical superiority. The first and perhaps most important lesson of Tannenberg was the understanding of the critical role of coordination between different branches of service. The German command masterfully used infantry, artillery, and cavalry as a single mechanism. Artillery preparation was precisely coordinated with infantry attacks. Cavalry performed reconnaissance tasks, providing the command with up-to-date information. The Russian army, on the contrary, often acted disjointedly. Artillery did not support the infantry, and cavalry was used ineffectively. The second key lesson was the necessity of decentralizing command. German corps and division commanders had significant autonomy in decision-making. They could adapt to changing circumstances without constant requests to higher headquarters. The Russian army suffered from excessive centralization. Any deviation from the original plan required the sanction of the High Command, which, in conditions of disrupted communication, led to a paralysis of control. The third lesson of Tannenberg was the realization of the decisive role of communications in modern warfare. The German communication system, which included field telephones and secure radio communication, ensured constant contact between headquarters and troops. The Russian army relied on couriers and unencrypted radio messages, which made command slow and vulnerable to interception. Tannenberg also demonstrated the advantages of internal lines of communication. The Germans used an extensive network of railways for rapid troop transfers from one sector of the front to another. This allowed them to create local superiority at decisive points, despite the enemy's overall numerical advantage. Military theorists of the interwar period carefully studied the experience of Tannenberg. It was analyzed particularly deeply in Germany. General Hans von Seeckt, the creator of the Reichswehr in the 1920s, made maneuver warfare the cornerstone of the new military doctrine. Erich von Manstein, one of the architects of the Blitzkrieg, repeatedly referred to Tannenberg as a classic example of the encirclement and destruction of a large enemy force. In the Soviet Union, where the catastrophe of the Russian army was remembered, valuable lessons were also drawn. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, in developing the theory of deep operations, took into account the experience of Tannenberg. Special attention was paid to the interaction of branches of service, the command of large formations, and the protection of communications. Western military theorists, such as British General John Fuller and Captain Basil Liddell Hart, viewed Tannenberg as proof of the superiority of maneuver warfare over positional warfare. Their works significantly influenced the development of military thought in Great Britain, France, and the USA. The concept of blitzkrieg, applied by Germany at the beginning of World War II, was largely based on the experience of Tannenberg. Rapid breakthroughs by tank wedges, the encirclement of large enemy forces, the use of aviation to disrupt communications, all these elements had roots in operations of the First World War, and Tannenberg was one of their prototypes. Tannenberg changed the perception of the commander's role on the battlefield. The figures of Hindenburg and Ludendorff became models of a new type of military leadership. Commanders capable of managing a battle from headquarters, relying on accurate information and reliable communication, rather than personally leading troops into attack. The Battle of Tannenberg left an indelible mark on the historical memory of three nations whose destinies intertwined on the fields of East Prussia in the summer of 1914. For each nation, this battle became a symbol imbued with special meaning, reflecting national traumas, hopes, and aspirations. In the German consciousness, Tannenberg transformed into a myth of a great victory that saved the homeland from enemy invasion. Immediately after the battle, German propaganda began to create an image of triumph comparable to the ancient battles of the Germanic tribes against the Romans. The name Tannenberg was not chosen by chance. It was in these very places in 1410 that the Teutonic Knights suffered defeat at the hands of the Polish-Lithuanian army. Now, the Germans symbolically avenged that ancient humiliation. Hindenburg and Ludendorff became national heroes. Their portraits adorned postcards, posters, and magazines. In schools, children were told about the brilliant maneuver that allowed a small force to defeat the Russian Colossus. A grandiose memorial, the Tannenberg Memorial, was erected at the battle site, becoming a place of pilgrimage for German patriots. During the Weimar Republic, the myth of Tannenberg acquired a new resonance. In a society traumatized by defeat in the First World War, memories of a great victory became a source of solace and hope. When the Nazis came to power, they masterfully exploited this symbol. Hindenburg, who became president of Germany, was presented as a link between the glorious past and a reawakening Germany. After his death in 1934, Hindenburg was buried in the Tannenberg Memorial, which gave the site an almost sacred significance. For Russians, Tannenberg became a symbol of national tragedy and betrayal. In official documents, the battle was called the Samsonov Catastrophe, avoiding the mention of Tannenberg. The image of General Samsonov, who chose suicide over capture, became a symbol of officers' honor among the military. At the same time, the defeat intensified distrust of the high command and of the Tsar personally. After the revolution, Soviet historiography long viewed Tannenberg as an example of the incompetence of the Tsarist regime and its generals. Emphasis was placed on the suffering of ordinary soldiers, abandoned by incompetent commanders. Only in the second half of the 20th century did more objective studies begin, acknowledging the complexity of the situation and the tragic plight of the Russian army. For Poles, the battle held special significance. The territory where the battle unfolded was inhabited by ethnic Poles, who found themselves caught between two fires. Many Polish soldiers fought in the ranks of the German army against the Russians, whom most Poles considered oppressors. In interwar Poland, which gained independence after centuries of partitions, Tannenberg was perceived as proof of the weakness of the empires that had divided Polish lands. In the contemporary historical consciousness of the three nations, Tannenberg occupies different places. In Germany, which underwent denazification and a re-evaluation of its past, this battle has lost its former heroic aura. Today, German historians view it as part of the tragedy of the First World War, the first act of the 20th century European catastrophe. In Russia, interest in Tannenberg has revived in recent decades. Modern researchers strive for an objective analysis of the causes of the defeat, paying tribute to the courage of Russian soldiers and the tragic nature of the situation. In Polish historical memory, Tannenberg remains a symbol of an era when Poles were forced to fight for foreign interests, divided by the borders of empires.